Good morning, afternoon, and evening to all of our listeners wherever you are in the world. Welcome back to the Cut the Carbon podcast. We're your link to climate advocates from across the globe, here to let them tell their own stories on fighting the climate crisis. We talk to our guests about climate matters that matter to them and how their countries are cutting carbon emissions. I'm your host, Patricia Manarang. In today's episode, we have Malak Altaeb from Libya. Malak is here to talk about how climate change is affecting Libya, as well as the state of energy security in the country. Let's hear a snippet from today's episode.
Libya should use or leverage its civil society and youth advocacy, which can play a huge role in pushing for this transition, even if there are obstacles, if we're talking about financial obstacles or even political obstacles, but having the public agreement or public support to make that transition possible is crucial within this overall plan.
If you'd like to support this podcast at Cut the Carbon, don't forget to subscribe to our channels and follow us on our socials, which can be found in the description. This interview has been edited for clarity purposes. Some audio issues may arise due to connectivity problems. Hi Malak, to start us off, can you introduce yourself and tell our listeners what you do?
Thank you so much for having me in the episode today. My name is Malak Altaeb. I'm from Libya, but I'm based in Paris, France. I've been living here for now 7 years. I have a master's degree in environmental policy, and I've been working as an independent consultant and researcher focusing on environmental policy with a focus on the water, energy, and food security lens and analysis within the MENA region, the Middle East and North Africa. And my work has been mainly focusing on the policy analysis and implications linked to water, food security, and also energy security within the MENA region and in comparison to global efforts.
To contextualize our episodes, we like to ask our guests to talk about how climate change is impacting their countries. Are there any specific climate change impacts happening in Libya that are fairly new or maybe unique to the region?
Definitely. I mean, when we look at Libya within the global, let's say, platform, but specifically within the African continent lens, Libya is characterized by a Mediterranean climate. But overall, when we look at the impacts of climate change, we have been seeing manifestations of climate change in the last few years, for instance, through rising temperatures, also decreasing rainfall. I mean, Libya generally is characterized by an arid and semi-arid climate due to its location and also having 90% of its land being desert. So rainfall is quite specific and limited to a specific coastal area within the country. But now, because of climate change, we're seeing a drastic decrease in rainfall, also increased rate of desertification. When we look at, for instance, images of maps from the 1970s to now, we can see an increase in the coverage of desertification in the country. Also, these effects are exacerbated by water scarcity, which is now considered one of the most pressing issues in the country. But when we look at the impacts that are happening recently or are new, we've seen a drastic or a striking example due to the recent floods in Derna, in the northeastern part of the country caused by Storm Daniel. This highlights the impact of extreme weather events that have become more frequent now for the case of Libya. Also, we have climate-induced displacement is becoming more noticeable. We're seeing more people being displaced from, for instance, for the increase of drought, also desertification affecting the viability of agriculture in their areas and forcing people to move, even though it's an internal displacement. But this is something that has been reoccurring more often due to the impacts of climate change, with vulnerable populations migrating due to these impacts. Also, Libya, now we're seeing an increased rate of saltwater intrusion to coastal groundwater aquifers, and this issue has been accumulating in the last few years, flagging the most likely of Libya's experiencing sea level rise, and that's another impact that we have been seeing as well in the country.
Thank you for giving us a glimpse into the effects of climate change in Libya. So, not only does climate change worsen existing phenomena, which is quite alarming because, as you said, Libya doesn't experience a lot of rainfall in the first place, but there's also new effects like more frequent extreme weather events, water scarcity, displacement of vulnerable groups, and the rise of sea levels. So, let's talk about one of your specialties, which is energy security. How would you describe the state of energy security in Libya?
Okay, so when we look at Libya from an energy security lens, Libya primarily relies on fossil fuels to cover its energy needs, both in terms of electricity and also transport. So oil and gas as resources are central to the country's energy security and also economic stability. This sector is considered the country's main source of economic revenue. But this reliance also poses now, and we're seeing it, challenges on the country, specifically with the global shifts that we are seeing within the geopolitical lens, but also globally in terms of oil prices. So this shift that we're seeing now towards renewable energy and concerns about sustainability. So the energy security, when we see it in Libya, is vulnerable not only to the global shifts to renewable energies, but also vulnerability that we have now due to the political instability in the country since 2011, also the mismanagement of the energy sector in general, and there is the high infrastructure decay. So Libya faces significant challenges in terms of diversifying its energy sources to secure the long-term energy reliance and to keep up with the global shifts to renewable energies.
So, to sum it up, Libya is heavily reliant on fossil fuels, and combined with things like political instability and other factors, it is difficult for the country to keep up with the global shift to renewable energy and finding more diverse energy means. That's the government and the industry. But what does civil society think of issues like this? What are their thoughts and opinions on energy security, reducing carbon emissions, and climate change in general?
Definitely, this is a good question. So, when we look at the civil society role in Libya, we've seen an increase and quite an active participation of civil society, generally speaking, in different fields. If we're talking about women empowerment, if we're talking about civic engagement, if we're talking about political participation, and as such, this has become more engaged with climate change and energy security in recent years. We've seen since 2011 and even before that an emergence of youth led initiatives. If we're talking about waste management, if we're talking about agriculture, if we're talking about raising awareness in general of the impacts of climate change, we have a few non-governmental youth-led organizations in Libya that focus on addressing these issues and also bringing light on these issues within the local context, especially following, for instance, disasters like the Derna floods. This has shown the level of power and also impact youth-led organizations have in terms of managing the aftermath of Storm Daniel. However, due to the political instability in the country and the lack of unified national policy, and here we're talking about the policy aspect, this have hindered the large-scale advocacy. So we're seeing that, yes, we have an activity by civil society in Libya, especially within the climate change and energy security, and as such, and also environmental policy in general, but the impact is slowed down drastically because of the political situation as it impacts it directly. So here, if we're talking about youth that are directly involved in environmental movements in the country, they are pushing for greater attention to climate change, also clean energy, also sustainable practices, but their influence, as I highlighted, is limited due to the country's ongoing political fragmentation and also lack of clear environmental policies from the governmental level. So if we talk about the bottom level, we can see that there is quite a high activity in that regard. But if the governmental level that is role to put in force certain policies is lagging, the impact is a bit vague in a sense. So there is an activity, yes, but if we talk about the impact level, it's still limited in some areas, and one of them is the energy-related activism. So there is an increasing awareness. Yes, this is the positive part, is that since 2011 until now, we're seeing a high activity and also high level of awareness from the community and also high level of awareness efforts by civil society in Libya, especially among youth. But in terms of the need to reduce carbon emissions and also protect natural resources, the awareness is high, but the policy implications is hindering the efforts that are being put in force by civil society in the country.
That's really interesting to hear. There is public awareness from civil society, but not enough initiatives or support from the government to actually help them. I think that's a trend I've seen in a lot of countries. The policies just aren't there, and sometimes they even serve as barriers for civil society's efforts. We had Selma Bishbish from Algeria on the podcast, and she mentioned that her NGO found the logistics and getting approvals and all of that difficult for their activities. So that's a bit of a peek at the government of Libya's priorities, but what exactly is their stance on decarbonization? Is it a pressing issue for them? Is it put on the back burner? Are there any policies or strategies in place to transition to renewable energy?
So in Libya, the transition is still not quite clear. What we have seen in the last few years, let's say a decade, a past decade, we've seen that there are a few projects that have been implemented that focuses on renewable energy, especially the expansion of solar energy utilization in different parts in the country. But when we look at the energy holistic structure, we still see it based on fossil fuels. So the Libyan government has shown some interest in transitioning to renewable energy through the National Oil Cooperation, which is in abbreviation the NOC, but the efforts remain limited and inconsistent in a sense. So Libya's national energy policies still focuses primarily on fossil fuel exploitation in terms of like fossil fuel exploration, expansion of the existing plants, and as such, and the sustainable efforts to decarbonize the energy sector are considered lacking in a sense. For instance, in COP28, former head of the National Oil Cooperation expressed that hopes to integrate more renewable energy projects using the fossil fuel industry in order to make that transition possible. This makes sense because the transition is not possible without having a sustainable economic source. The country would use the fossil fuel industry as the main source to make the transition slowly but steadily. However, the change in the National Oil Cooperation management now raises questions on whether this management is going to implement or make the shift to renewable energies on the long term and also on the shorter term. So Libya, yes, expressed interest in diversifying its energy mix through renewable sources. I mentioned here solar. There are a few explorations on wind, but solar takes the majority in terms of like shifting. A few small-scale renewable energy projects exist. We've seen it in different parts in the country, in the southern part, also in the northeastern and northwestern parts of the country. But there is no comprehensive national strategy that is pushing for that shift on the national level. Here we're talking about different sectors, whether it's transportation, whether it's domestic use, and as such. So the absence of a unified policy structure on the energy transition in Libya as a policy framework still hinders the progress in decarbonizing energy. So we're talking about the National Oil Cooperation, for instance, it must enforce a clear structure and also a framework that focuses on the decarbonization of energy sources in Libya and making the shift using the existing oil sector to make that shift is possible, given that a few projects of renewable energy exist already. So the shift can be done, but it needs to be done in a more strategic and localized manner.
So there is a slight interest in decarbonizing energy, but from what you're saying, Libya is still very much focused on fossil fuels and exploiting expansion and exploration. Policy frameworks are definitely needed, especially in an industry as loud and prominent as the oil sector. Speaking of sectors, are there other sectors in Libya that are heavily involved or invested in decarbonization? Is there pushback from them, or are they supportive of decarbonizing?
Speaking about different sectors, I would say it's quite complicated because still the public sectors in Libya in general still work by the book meaning that they still use old management techniques and practices that were implemented decades ago. So the shift is not something that the public sector, I would say, I wouldn't say they're not considering, but it's not something that is considered as a priority, but more of managing the existing challenges or issues or even day-to-day affairs. So talking about decarbonization for different public sectors, if we're talking about the agriculture, if we're talking about transportation, if we're talking about different sectors in the country, it needs to come from a higher level, meaning that it needs to come from the governmental lens in order to put certain orders for different public sectors to push for the transition or the decarbonization from a sector level. So I wouldn't say that it's a sector-based intent or decision, but more of how the government can lead different sectors to push for that transition and to lead the decarbonization within their sectors strategically.
This last question may be a difficult one, but given your expertise, Malak, I'm confident you'll have a lot of substantial things to say. How do you think Libya should deal with their energy security, and how should they transition to renewable energy? Do you have any specific ideas for policymakers or industry leaders?
Definitely. I mean, I've expressed this not only for the energy sector, but given that I've been working on the analysis of the water food security nexus in the country, and energy is connected to the two. When we talk about the Libyan next steps, Libya should begin by prioritizing energy diversification. I was in Libya last week, and I got the chance, I mean, after a long time of living abroad, I got the chance to see what changed, what didn't. But when we talk about the energy, focusing on the energy sector in terms of changes, prioritization of the energy diversification through investments in renewable energy, these are crucial for Libya to invest in, and not only as a government, but we're talking here about the private sector. The private sector has a huge leverage and role, especially that the role of private sector has increased in different sectors since 2011, and we've seen more steps taken by the private sector that the public sector did not take. But this also can be translated in the having more of the public-private partnership in a sense. If we talk about investment-wise, policymakers should focus on creating a national energy transition plan that integrates not only the decarbonization strategies, but also energy security goals. Companies from the private sector lens should invest in the necessary infrastructure to support renewable energy implementation. A few years back, I've seen in different parts in the country that there was an emergence. It was very humble in a way. We've seen a few privately owned local renewable energy companies in the country to implement solar panels for domestic use. However, at that time, a high usage of oil run electricity generators. And at that time, the country was facing a long periods of power cuts. And at that time, when people were investing, at that time, solar energy was quite expensive in comparison to the oil-fueled or powered electricity generators. So at that time, people did not have the option but to go for the cheaper option. Why? Because governments did not provide incentives, economic incentives for the private sector to ensure that they can sustain their practice and also support the domestic transition to using solar panels. So here, transitioning to renewable energy will require not only the investment from the private sector, but having the economic viable incentives from the public sector, but also international support in terms of the financial resources, also the technology transfer as a knowledge transfer, especially given Libya's political instability and infrastructure limitations. And finally, I can say that Libya should use or leverage its civil society and youth advocacy, which can play a huge role in pushing for this transition, even if there are obstacles, if we're talking about financial obstacles or even political obstacles, but having the public agreement or public support to make that transition possible is crucial within this overall plan.
So, prioritizing energy diversification, economic incentives from the government, and investments from the private sector, and a concrete national energy transition plan are just some of your suggestions for Libya. I want to hone in on the last thing you said, which is the participation of civil society. I wholly agree. At Cut the Carbon, we really prioritize the opinions and ideas of civil society, and it's really important that governments empower them, as well as youth advocates, to participate to the best of their abilities. To end this episode, Mala, can you give us some climate or environmental organizations in Libya that you'd like our listeners to check out?
I was part of the Libyan Youth Climate Movement since 2014-15, and the organization has been working on the advocacy, but also climate change awareness campaigns, and it has worked on different levels. And since then, I wanted to just give a shout out to the Libyan Youth Climate Movement for the work that they have done and the awareness and advocacy they have pushed for in order to bring the community together around climate change issues. Another organization, it's called Friends of the Mountains. They focus on limiting desertification and planting campaigns in different parts in the country, but now their focus mainly is on the Nafusa mountain in the northwestern part of the country, where they have been working on increasing the green coverage, and their work has gained public support and also support by different local privately owned companies in order to increase the green coverage in the affected areas. So these two that I wanted to give a shout out to and also highlight in this episode.
Thank you so much, Malak. I and our listeners have learned a lot from your expertise and knowledge.
Seriously, thank you, Patricia. All thanks to you for your time, for the efforts, for even the questions, and for shedding light on energy security. I mean, energy is covered in different ways, also from the political aspect, but to have a dedicated episode about the energy sector and security in Libya is something that I truly appreciate. So thank you for your time and for the space to talk about it.
That was a jam-packed episode. We talked to Malak Altaeb from Libya about energy security, civil societies, the government's and the private sector's views on decarbonizing energy, and some moves that policymakers can make to support the transition to renewable energy. Let us know your thoughts about this episode in the comments or through our social media. We'd love to start a discussion with you about today's episode. Next episode, we talked to Alisa Belda from the Philippines about decarbonizing transport. So keep your ears peeled for that. You can subscribe to this podcast on Spotify, YouTube, and SoundCloud. Follow our Instagram at cut.thecarbon, our Blue Sky at cutthecarbon.bsky.social, and our LinkedIn, Cut the Carbon. Visit our website, cutthecarbon.eco, to learn more about us. Thank you for tuning in. Never forget that the climate crisis isn't fought alone or only through one way. Bye! See you next time!